Hey folks, welcome to Bear Mountain today. Today we're going to do some work on biochar. It's kind of a rainy, going to be stormy day for today and for the next few days, and so we're going to do some stuff that are inside the hoop house. And this biochar is going to be harvested, this group is going to be harvested for sweet peas. And then I thought we'd also kind of walk you through our process of how we do the two steps of charging, which means adding nutrients to, and inoculating raw biochar. We've got some stuff that we're going to be making up for our potting mix, which is a finer blend of biochar. So let's get at it. Okay, so today we're just about in just about mid-February at this point. It's been about 3 weeks since we did the biochar burn with mostly pruning scraps from cherrywood tree and fir trees and things of that nature. And we made a biochar out of that, and we started the inoculation process about 2 to 3 weeks ago. Now what we did is we're trying to make certain that we're using something that can breathe. So during the actual charging process, or I should say the inoculating and charging process, we want to kind of keep the biochar moist, but also using this polyweave fabric, keep it in the crate, and simultaneously give it some oxygen too. About 4 days ago, we had a pretty good fungal bloom on the top, and I think it's pretty much done. And the reason how we can say that it's pretty much done is the pH when we started this process was it was off the chart. It was over 10, and did a pH test on this morning, show the picture of it, and we're just like at about 6.9 or 7. So the alkaline, or the basic nature of this, has really changed. It's got a lot of biology in it now. In some cases, the material is almost feels different, almost feels like a bit less crunchy. It's definitely got some parts that it still have hyphae in it that you can see. And so when we dump this, we're going to get kind of an interesting thing, I think, is we're going to get some loose spots, and then we're going to get some spots with some clumps and things in there where the fungal hyphae is still there. Most of the food in here has been exhausted, so there really isn't any point to kind of keep it going anymore. And we want to use this tray to inoculate another round that we want to use for our potting mix. So we're going to dump this into this and see what it looks like, and then transfer it into some 4-gallon buckets that we're going to use this on our sweet pea bed. So let's get it dumped out. It's a little heavy, so certain that I knock everything down. Okay, we're just going to kind of dump here. So it's kind of coming out, the loose stuff on the top. Oh yeah, see, here's a nice clump right here. It's got still got fungal hyphae in it. A lot of moisture. There's no odor with this anymore. You know, like charcoal has a charcoal odor. That is gone. Just a little bit. You can see I even got a worm in here, so you know this is kind of ready.
It's a block.
Yeah, it kind of came out in a block, and that's a function of, you know, you can still see some spots where there's fungal hyphae. There's still quite a bit of moisture in it, which is good. It might have even been a little bit too moist, but yeah, it really, I mean, look at it, it's holding together. It's like got total fungal. I mean, look at that. That's a block. Pretty wild, huh?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, yeah, you can break it apart. So that's good. That means it did what it was supposed to do. And yeah, we just kind of break it apart a little bit. And then we're going to transfer this over to some storage buckets. And this stuff should be ready to apply. I mean, if I got a worm living in here, I don't know what he's eating. It's got to be crazy. Even he looks healthy though. That's wild. So he just crawled in here on his own, so he must be eating some of the fungal hyphae or something. And there's absolutely no odor. None. You want to attest to this, Mrs. Producer?
I'll take your word for it. I'm a little stuffed up today.
Okay, so this is good to go, and I mean, look at that. I even got some weed seeds that wanted to germinate. That's wild.
Boo.
Yeah. So I got more than one worm in here. So this is definitely ready. So most of the, it looks like most of the hyphae is kind of like, you know, it's run its course, so it's probably sporulated. The food source, like I said, is gone on it. So this stuff is ready for application. Now, a lot of people say you don't need to do this to the biochar before you apply it. There are some people who say that's just a bunch of garbage, but here's the reason why we do it. I want to get that pH level down closer to where the soil is. I want to make certain that the biochar has had time to absorb as much moisture as it can, so it doesn't create a situation in the soil where its very nature is going to be to start attracting water and sucking up nutrients with that water. Now, some people say, oh, that doesn't happen, but I have seen enough studies on, you know, looking at what universities have done, that applying raw biochar to an area can take 2 to 3 years for the material to get to its peak performance. And the question is, why do you want to use it? You know, if you've already got a soil that's really high in organic matter, and you've been working it, you know, for years with compost, and you know, you've got it mineralized right, and the biology is rocking and rolling. The reality is, adding this kind of longer term, slower to break down carbon, probably you're not going to see any great benefit. But in a sense, the major thing about this kind of carbon is it's going to take many more years for this carbon to break down. It's going to be available for the plant and the soil system to use much longer than a compost. So I'm looking for two benefits from this. The first is that by applying biochar, I'm going to provide more of a home in our soil. It is pretty low in organic matter in some places, so that the biology has open, porous places to live. Secondly, this is going to help with water retention in the summer. So I should be able to, you know, once I get a few years of application on this, I should be able to, in my tunnels, use less water than I normally have been using. And the last thing about this is that if you can get your biochar, my personal belief is somewhere between, you know, 5% or so, 3 to 5% of your top rooting rhizosphere area to being good biochar, that it's going to cut down on the need for putting in large doses of compost. I just want to get it down in my tunnels where I'm applying compost, you know, talking about like a 1/4 inch dusting every year. And that this is going to be really the basis of the long-term carbon that's in the system. The other advantage of this is made this stuff ourselves, so we didn't have to pay for it. We did pay for a flour for an inoculant and some rock dust, but honestly, the only thing you need to do a good inoculation is a source of nitrogen/protein for the bacteria and the microbes to use, an inoculant of some type, whether it's worm castings or compost soil or a compost tea or all broad variety of things. If you can get all of these things, or the majority of these things, either low cost or no cost, this can become a real big multiplier in terms of how much carbon you get in your soil, versus having to either make tons and tons of compost or buy tons and tons of compost. So that's kind of our objective. That's what we're trying to get to here.
And what did you burn to get the biochar?
Well, honestly, you know, in this batch was tree prunings. So it was prunings that were maybe 1 inch or less in diameter. They were from a cherry tree, and some of them were from fir trees or large shrubs. This batch that we're going to inoculate today is totally 100% burned up blackberry vines.
Do we have a shortage of
We have
those?
no shortage of blackberry vines. Basically, if you can, you can make biochar out of basically any organic matter that you can burn or basically heat up to a really high temperature in a low oxygen environment, it's going to char.
So when we trim our fruit trees, our apples and pear tree, you'll burn
Yep.
those?
Yeah. So basically anything on the property, if we burn it right, it number one, it doesn't really emit the smoke that a bottom lit fire does. A top lit fire will burn from the top, and as the fumes or the gases of the consuming materials are burned, the flames are right there, and so basically once the fire gets hot, the level of smoke is a fraction. And depending on what you do, we're doing just open type field burns and piles.
Because we can do that.
Yeah, we can do that here. But say you're in an area that you can't do that. Well, there are many videos out there on making motorcycles running. Anyway,
neighbors.
there's many videos out there on YouTube about top loading, updraft type. They call them T-LUDs, which are basically a barrel inside of a barrel type thing, and they emit almost no smoke or anything like that, and they can create really good biochar. In this case, though, since we're in an area where agriculturally we can burn,
because it's also raining.
Yeah, and Oregon, Western Oregon, gets a lot of precipitation in the wintertime, so. Okay, this was biochar that we burned in an open top lit fire down about 2 days ago. It was all blackberry, and I sifted through to get it rid of any parts that hadn't burned. There's a little bit of native soil in it, but for the most part it is definitely char. It smells like charcoal. And our next step here, and this is a 5-gallon batch of the stuff, we're going to use this stuff because it's much finer. Once it's kind of cured, we're going to use this in our potting mix. Or if we don't use it in potting mix, we'll be using it in making spring JLF when we make grass liquid fertilizer. We'll be using some biochar in that to basically help with the fermentation process. So what do we need to do to do this? Our process is simply we're going to use a cheap flour for a protein source, which proteins have nitrogen in it, so that'll be a feed source. And then we're going to use basalt rock dust that we got from concentrates. It's pretty cheap stuff. And then we're going to use vermicast, our own vermicast in it, to help with some organisms and inoculation on that end of it. And then the last thing we're going to do is we're going to moisturize it with about 1 liter or 2 of freshly brewed Jadam microorganism solution. And so the point of what we're trying to do here is introduce as much biology as possible, give them a food source, give them some minerals, and let them do their thing for about 3 or 4 weeks. So I've got in here, this is 5 gallons of biochar. I've got roughly about 2 pounds of rock dust, and I'm going to be adding that. And I'm just going to make sure that I get that mixed around. I want to make certain that I get as much of the rock dust, incorporated into the biochar, so that all the biochar has some exposure to that. Now, if you're doing this in large batches, you could use a cement mixer quite easily. There's already some moisture in here from the quenching of the biochar, so it's probably about, I don't know, maybe 30-40% moisture right now.
Remind everybody what quenching means.
Okay, when the fire is going, this is how you prevent the fire from burning everything down to white ash. The whole point is when you're doing that top lit thing is it's burning down and you start to see it just kind of white coating of ash on one layer. Then you add another layer of fuel and you wait for that same process to see a little bit of white ash. Then you add more fuel, more fuel. So the whole point is the fire will begin to burn down and pyrolyze the materials underneath it, creating charcoal, and will also create charcoal from the layers you're adding into it, because those layers, when you're putting the next layer on, are not fully burned out, but they will pyrolyze and they will char, repetitively until you get to the size of the pile that you want. And at some particular point, you're going to have to call it. And when you do, what you're doing is you're waiting for that last layer to start showing some white ash. And quenching is the process. You're going to drench that entire pile with water to put the fire out. You want to get the heat out of the char as quickly as possible, and you're going to get a lot of steam when you first start that process. But it's basically, you keep putting on enough water until the fire is completely out. You can you can shovel the char out at that point and put it into like a barrel container or a big wheelbarrow or something like that, and keep it soaking for about 24 hours. But as long as you get it out and you get the temperature down, and the char is quenched, meaning it's absorbing that water so it can't reignite itself. So that's where this is. It's got the moisture in there from the quenching, and we're adding the rock dust now. Okay, the last step before we put the inoculant in is we're putting the food source in, and this is 5 pounds of flour. So basically for every gallon of char, we're putting in about a pound of flour. This is the cheapest flour you could find. It is organic, interesting. The only reason I do that is I want to make sure that there had been any non-organic. Could have used wheat that was cured with using glyphosate to get the moisture out of it. And I want to make sure that glyphosate is an herbicide that also has bacterial-side tendencies, and I want to make sure there isn't any of that in here. Apologize for the rain, folks. It is Oregon. So we're going to mix that into the process. Okay, the charge portion of the show is now complete. And what you can see is the flour has basically been absorbed by the charcoal itself. So it's actually even got a different feel to it. It doesn't feel as gritty as it used to. So the flour's really combined, it's coated all of the existing biochar. So the next thing we're going to do is we're going to inoculate from 2 different sources. Now, before I move on about this, I want to talk a little bit about charging. You can say, wow, you're buying flour and you're making like 5 gallons of this stuff, and maybe you spent, I don't know, $2, $3 on a bag of flour, but maybe even more, depending, maybe even more, depending on where you are. If you're buying biochar, you're going to have to probably charge it, do it yourself, and charge and inoculate it yourself. But hey, if you want to be absolutely zero cost, there are ways that you can do this depending what you're really looking for, sources of nitrogen. So if you think about on your farm, what do you have as a source of nitrogen? It could be, if you have animals, as an example, it could be manures. It could be, cow urine. It could be your own urine. Believe it or not, urine put into this charcoal, it quickly loses any odor. It's gone. Because I know
the idea.
It's the idea that probably grosses people out. But or like if you live on the coast and you have access to fish waste and things of that nature, fish waste put into a bucket and made into a JLF has a very high nitrogen level to it. That would be an excellent inoculant. Or let's just say, for our argument's sake, you had access to some old fish hydroslate, fish emulsion. You could use that. That would work too. So there's a variety of different things. If you have old stuff laying around, you can use that. That has some form of nitrogen in it. That's the whole point. You're trying to get a nitrogen, a protein source into this that will feed the biology. So you don't have to use flour. That's not, and you don't have to use worm castings, and you don't have to use JMS for an inoculant. You can use leaf mold soil. You could use soil from the bottom of your compost pile. You could use compost itself. Many people go through this whole process and they just go, it doesn't matter, I'm going to use the compost, so they just throw their biochar in the compost pile, let it work through the process. That will also do the same job. We're doing this specifically because we want as much biochar to be used in a mix, or to get it as close into the plant root zone as we can. So that's kind of why we're going through this extra effort. But the whole point on this is you don't have to spend, really, you could do this actually totally for free if you just don't mind the oogie factor of certain things.
The oogie factor.
So what we're going to do is we don't need a lot of inoculant. So I'm going to put in about probably 2 scoops of these worm castings. That this isn't the best worm castings. It still has some refuse left over from things that didn't get digested with the worms. But
I think you need a new bucket.
yeah, that my bucket, really. The whole point, I guess, what I'm trying to do is just going to break this up and just kind of move it around. There's probably even some worm eggs in here too, but that's okay. So we're just going to kind of mix it up just like we mixed up the other things. The whole point of what we're trying to do is just kind of move the worm castings around into the biochar itself. Now, again, for inoculant, you could use good compost soil. You could use good compost. You could use anything that has a good diversity of biology in it. Compost teas. If you're using compost teas, that would be good too. So that's the whole point. So we're just going to kind of mix that up a little bit. Don't need a wood chip. And as long as it gets fairly evenly dispersed in the mixture, the biology should, be pretty equal and through it all. Okay, that's probably good enough for that. Now, the last thing I'm going to do is I'm going to add directly at 100% strength. This is a batch of JMS that got mature this morning, and it's got tons of biology in it. And I'm going to use this in addition to the worm castings. This can, I've got a mark on the inside of it, gives me about 2 liters. And that's what I'm going to put in here. And that should be more than enough. And we just got to mix that around. It's going to be a little bit on the wet side starting out, but it should be okay. I'm just trying to make sure that I get this all evenly dispersed. And it's interesting, when I put the JMS in, I can definitely still smell the char. But, in a couple of days, that will be totally gone. Okay, that's it. Now the next step is we're just going to load it back into our crate, and this is probably from looks like the volume of 5 gallons is somewhere probably around I don't know, maybe close to about 1 cubic foot probably. thereabouts. So let's transfer this over to our crate. So how long will this have to go in order for it to be ready? Sometimes it's temperature dependent, but usually what we do is no less than 2 to 3 weeks. What I look for is I look for a pH change, and I look for the fungal activity is kind of peaked and maybe has on its way down. That means the food in here has been consumed. So that's kind of basically what I'm looking for. But once it's done, you don't have to use it right away either. If you say, well, I've made it up and I won't need it till next spring, it's perfectly fine just to set it aside someplace. And because most of the biology in here is just going to go dormant. And as long as it doesn't go bone dry, make sure it still has some moisture in it. It should be good to store for, a month or so or something like that. It's not a big deal.
So it's okay to make it right now
Yeah.
for later on in the year.
Right. So most of the stuff is going to be used in our potting mix, like I said, going forward, March, April, maybe even into May. Okay, this crate will hold somewhere around 1 2/3 or I guess maybe 1.5 cubic feet. And it looks to me like what we ended up here with that mix and the 5 gallons was somewhere around 3/4 of a cubic foot. Now, what we're going to be doing with this is this, like I said, is kind of an expensive way to go. If I'm making materials that I'm just going to put out in the field, I'm probably going to use a much cheaper source of nitrogen. And if I don't have any rock dust available, I'm not going to sweat it. I'll just use some good soil. So these kinds of things are kind of like, you gotta try to keep the cost as low as possible. In this case, we put more expensive inputs into this because this is going to go into our potting mix. And what we're going to do is we're going to put it into the potting mix at about a 2% level. So this is going to go quite a ways in terms of how much. If you were just to use this straight, I mean, this is clearly not cost effective to do. But the point on this type of batch is we're trying to get it into the potting mix for the plants as they grow on. So when you say it's not going to be for mini blocks, it's going to be for things that are potted up or things that grow, germinate immediately in the 6-packs themselves. And the idea behind it is a couple things. First, you're going to have a lot of biology in here, and it's going to have balanced itself out and found itself homes in the biochar itself. Second, it's going to improve water retention and probably water filtration equally through the mix. So what we intend to see happen here is that the things in the 6-packs and stuff, you still have to check them every day, but maybe you don't, instead of watering them 3 times a day when it's warm, you only need to water them twice. It's going to help even out the moisture level instead of going from bone dry to wet, or constantly having to run your irrigation on a timer to keep things going. This should help even that out a bit. It'll also, like I said, give it a head start on some biology. This is not a fertilizer amendment, okay? So never think of it as that. This is simply an amendment that helps the biology around the plant itself. It helps retain water. That's the whole key point to this. And it's a type of carbon that once it goes in the ground, because those those plants, once they get to the transplant size, are going to carry that biochar into the soil with them too. So this is kind of it. It's kind of like we're trying to do it as cheap as possible. This particular example probably wasn't the greatest one to say cheap as possible, but as we talked about, there are things that you can do to make your own biochar at home. Charge it and inoculate it pretty dirt cheap. It just depends on what you want to do. So I want to thank you guys for watching today, and thanks for putting up with the rain in the tunnel. It might have been a little noisy, but we'll take some still shots and post up on some posts later on as this becomes mature, just to kind of give you guys an idea of how the batch is coming along. So thanks for watching today, and as always, stay safe out there and have a good day. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.